Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve. Thanks for stopping by. Before we begin, I'd like to advise you that this is a serious educational program. It's intended for mature audiences only. If you are not mature enough to make up your own mind about an idea, then you shouldn't watch it. Because I'm going to say a lot of things that are quite unconventional. And if you're not mature enough to make up your own mind about whether you think what I say is true or not, you might just end up being a mind zombie of mine. And that's something nobody wants to see, least of all me. So, that being said, YouTube deleted the episode previous to the last one that I recorded, and so I'm going to have to re-record it for you. I'm not sure why they deleted it. I think it was because I had too provocative a title. They sent me a whole series of policy violations that I read through very clearly, and as far as I could see, I had violated absolutely none of those. And so I think it was just the title that was a little too provocative for them. They figured that that title was going to get them in trouble with the watchdogs of morality that are keeping an eye on YouTube to keep the world safe from dangerous ideas. So those people indeed would like to keep the world safe from my dangerous ideas, I'm quite sure. However, I feel that I have the right to express them. As Thomas Jefferson and James Madison said, the government has no right to regulate what people think. The government has no jurisdiction over people's opinions about things. And I think that should go for any segment of the public. No segment of the public, whatever their beliefs happen to be, have the jurisdiction over the opinions of other segments of the population with whom they may disagree. Everybody's got the right to their own opinions, and I have one or two. Now, what was I talking about? What am I trying to do basically with this series? I'll give you a little background about myself first. I have a bachelor's degree in general psychology, in which I studied personality theories, theories of counseling and therapy, behavior modification and learning theory, cognition, perception, and experimental psychology, as well as statistics. Then I went on to get a degree in the one form of psychology that was not covered in my bachelor's degree, which is humanistic psychology. And so I got my master's degree in humanistic psychology. What is humanistic psychology? It's the psychology of personal growth and self-actualization. How individuals can go from beyond just not being psychologically sick anymore, just getting up to sort of normal, but being able to go beyond that and develop our positive potentials for happiness and pleasure in life. One of which is sexuality, sexual pleasure and sexual happiness, and successful sexual relationships with other people, successful sexual relationships with ourselves and our own sexuality, so that we are friends with our own sexuality and we are friends with other people who accept our sexuality and we accept their sexuality, and we can enjoy our sexuality together because we have a similar type of sexual enjoyment. And where does that come from? That comes from our brain. From the emotional brain, this area in red there, that's where all of our sexual preferences and sexual turn-ons and all of our sexual learning that we've had throughout our entire life, all of that is recorded and evaluated by our emotional brain. So, after I got my master's degree in humanistic psychology, I went on and got a teaching credential in 3 subjects: English, social sciences, and physical education, because I had learned that the physical side of psychotherapy, body-mind therapy, is critical to achieving super euphoric sexual states. That is, pre-orgasmic sexual arousal that fills our entire consciousness. I mean, the entire consciousness. And that we can let that go on for a long period of time, sort of surging and subsiding. And then eventually, when we trigger the orgasm reflex, at that point, we have a full brain orgasm, which is the ultimate in orgasms. I call it the cosmic orgasm, or the oceanic orgasm, because it feels like the whole cosmos, which is our consciousness, is having the orgasm. The whole cosmos actually only exists for us inside the field of consciousness, which our brain is producing at all times. Our brain produces a reproduction of the outside world in that field of consciousness, but that field of consciousness is where we experience everything that we experience, including our sexual pleasure and our orgasms. And so when we can have an orgasm that sends waves of orgasmic pleasure through our entire consciousness, then it feels like the entire cosmos is having an orgasm. And I wish that were the case. I wish I could give the entire cosmos an orgasm every time that I have a cosmic orgasm. That would be wonderful. I think I could solve all the world's problems, immediately. End to war. No more wars. No, I'm just going to stay and wait for Steve to have another cosmic orgasm so I can enjoy that. But sadly enough, I can't transfer my cosmic orgasms to you. The only thing I can transfer to you is how to make cosmic orgasms, how to have them, how to make them yourself. But you're the one who's responsible for creating them. That's work that I can't do for you. Everybody has to do that for themselves. You have to walk that orgasmic road yourself. No one else can do it for you. In addition to that, I then spent a couple of months getting my massage credential, which is the best thing I ever did in my life, getting a massage credential, because what it did was it got me over my inhibition about touching people in a friendly, casual way. I was sort of raised in a non-touching culture, and for me to actually touch a girl when I was out on a date with her, my first girlfriend, I went out with her for 2 months practically without holding her hand or anything. We did some dancing, that was good, and then I finally kissed her. But when I got my massage credential, you spend 200 hours massaging people. And this was, with oil, naked people. Not erotic massage, but just relaxation massage and muscle loosening up massage, muscle relaxation massage. Wonderful, wonderful thing to do. And by the time I finished that course, it was natural for me to touch people that I was talking with in a friendly way, touch them in a non-invasive way, usually on the upper arm, occasionally on the upper back, rubbing your palm on someone's upper back if they happen to be sitting down and they're maybe not in a good mood or something. If you rub your hand on their upper back, just as though you were drying off a dish or something, a plate, a couple of times, do that real relaxed, that can really, brighten up their day. But of course, you don't want to do it if they don't want to be touched. So you've always got to be sensitive to that. everybody has the right to not be touched by somebody else if they don't want to be. But on the other hand, most of us are so touch starved, deprived of touch, that when somebody comes along and does touch us, it's very often our emotional brain, if we accept that as a friendly gesture, as a non-threatening gesture, as someone else's expression of affection and concern for us, if we can accept that touch, our emotional brain just goes into a state of euphoria immediately. That's one of the kinds of stimulation that can make our emotional brain release a bunch of euphoria into consciousness. And it's a shame that, in a way, that massage has become sexualized, and that when people think of massages, they always think of sexual massages, or often think of that. This is a shame, because massage is one of the great things that we can do for one another that, has the potential to be erotic, but on the other hand, has the potential to be simply nurturing. It's one of the best ways to give each other nurturing affection. And if you study our friend the emotional brain, one of the circuits in all this circuitry here, one of the circuits there that's most important is nurturing affection, which is what a baby needs from its mother. During the first few years of life, if a child receives nurturing affection, physical affection, by being held and cradled by its mother, that child is going to grow up to be a lot more emotionally stable and emotionally relaxed, because in those first few years of life, our emotional brain is learning how to feel. And the more experiences we have of learning how to feel safe, protected, and nurtured by someone who's bigger than us, who's taking care of us, then the more relaxed we're going to be as children. But if we're left alone, if the child is left alone, the child is going to have anxiety, because loneliness goes together with anxiety, of fear. No one's taking care of me. I'm alone by myself here. I'm lonely. I'm lost. I feel frightened because there's no one here to take care of me. Our emotional brain is designed in such a way that we are supposed to be in physical contact with an adult during the first few years of our life. In fact, in some cultures, children are physically in contact with an adult or a teenager, an older brother or sister, caretaker, somebody, all the time, 100% of the time. During their first few years of life, they're always in body contact with someone else, so they feel relaxed and safe. And then, when the child learns how to walk and run around, gradually the child will leave the individual who's holding them and will go off on its own for periods of time, join the other kids in playing, and then come back for more nurturing. But when you think about that kind of a culture, where babies and infants are nurtured 100% of the time as they are growing up, and then you see how we were brought up and how much time children spend alone without being nurtured, we are very much nurturing deprived. And massage is one of the best ways to nurture each other. We should form little tender nests of a small group of people who trust each other, who are friends, and who are affectionate with each other, to exchange nurturing affection, which includes not just massage, but sandwich hugs. And the massage can be clothes-on massage. That helps prevent it from becoming an erotic massage. But the group would have an agreement that massages do not become erotic, except if they're specifically designated to be erotic massages before they happen. But otherwise, the tenderness should be there for us to get the kind of nurturing affection, a sandwich hug, one person in front, one person in back, one person in the middle. That's a sandwich hug. The person in the middle feels like they are surrounded with human affection and nurturing. It's like being back in the womb, which is a good thing. Because when we were in the womb, that's when we were completely relaxed and we felt completely safe and warm and taken care of. So the sandwich hug is giving us a revitalizing experience of nurturing affection as though we were back in the womb. And these are wonderful things that we should give each other. And we've got plenty of people who can give each other sandwich hugs and clothes-on massage and other forms of nurturing affection. We've got plenty of people to do that, but people are too inhibited to do that because ours is a non-touchy-feely culture. Our culture likes to keep a certain distance between people and is frightened of touch. We're a touch-phobic culture, the traditional culture. And so the new culture should not be touch-phobic. It should not be nurturing affection-phobic either. So I got a massage credential. It was a great thing to do. And then I spent a year taking the pre-med course in anatomy and physiology at the local community college, where they had two very good teachers of anatomy and physiology. And I took the first semester of anatomy with one of the teachers, and then I took physiology. The difference between anatomy and physiology is anatomy is the structure of the body, and physiology is how that structure works, how all the internal organs work together. So that was spring semester. I took that with the same professor. But also during spring semester, the other professor asked me if I would sit in on his anatomy class and be the official class note taker. So that I would write down the notes from every class, I would type them up, and I would put them in the library so that any student who had missed the class could go and get the notes from the copy that was in the library. And if students needed to study for exams from those official notes, they could do that. And at the same time, I also tutored any of the students who wanted to in small groups. I tutored them in anatomy for their exams for that semester. And then the following summer, I noticed that the anatomy teacher was teaching his classes using the lecture notes that I had taken and typed up and put in the library. He made a copy for himself and was just using that to teach his classes with. So I got a pretty solid grounding in anatomy and physiology that year. And that got me interested because one of the teachers was interested in the brain. And he explained to me a little bit about how the brain worked and how the emotional brain worked. And I said, wow, that fits together so well with the body-mind pleasurology that I've been doing ever since 1972, which was like, by that time, 8 or 9, 10 years ago, 10 years earlier, about 8 years earlier. I started to do body-mind relaxation exercises that helped me get more relaxed. I did a lot of catharsis work, releasing emotions and getting out the poisonous anger that I felt that was making me tense and angry all the time, and that was, ruining my life because it was anger that I was feeling at my father, the Presbyterian minister, for the guilt trip about sex that he laid on me when I was a teenager. I had all this hatred for him around that because he made me feel so guilty so unnecessarily for so many years that I needed to release that anger. I didn't release it to him personally, but I got it out of my system. And I did a lot of that in an experimental theater play that I was in called Tom Paine, where there was a lot of good opportunity for emotional release during that. So I cleansed my personality of any backed up, dammed up, poisonous emotions, got them out of my system, learned how to relax my body, took a semester off from school, and just did yoga. Did physical yoga, did meditation, did breathing exercises, and learned how to stabilize my field of consciousness so that my field of consciousness became coherent instead of scattered. I've been very, very scattered up to that point. My attention darting here and there, and I had no control over where I was letting my attention go to. So my consciousness was constantly fragmented because I was always shifting my attention. Well, I started doing Zen meditation, which allowed me to focus my attention on a single spot, and at the same time, count my breaths, and at the same time, try to keep my mind free of thoughts. And if I found myself thinking about something instead of being aware of the present moment and my breathing, well, then I would let go of those thoughts, and I'd start counting my breaths again. I was trying to get up to 10 breaths without losing track because I had drifted off into thoughts. And that was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful exercise, one of the most important things that I have ever learned to do. And it's particularly important for driving. You should be able to do Zen driving so that you're paying attention as you drive instead of thinking about something else all the time, so you're only half paying attention to the traffic. No, you want to be paying 100% attention to the traffic as you drive to avoid accidents. So then after I did that year of anatomy and physiology study, that got me interested in neuroscience. One of the professors was interested in how the brain works, and he explained a little bit about the emotional brain. And where was I going to get more information on this? In 1981. No internet. They hadn't started doing even PET scans or anything like that, no MRI scans and stuff. Neuroscience was just barely getting underway in the late 70s and early 80s. I had to drive an hour and a half to go to a large university with a medical school and go to the medical school bookstore to find textbooks on neuroscience, on how the brain works and how it's put together, which is probably the single most complex subject of all human knowledge, is how the brain works. And there are all these names to learn and all of this shit, and what's this and that. So I started studying that and, buying this book and buying that book. Now it's so easy. You can go on the internet and go to Wikipedia and find anything you want about how the brain works, at least what we know about it so far. And so it's much easier to access that information now. But anyway, I had to do it, piecemeal here and there, buying books and studying them really hard. And when I would get a book, which would be very expensive, I would take a long time reading it very carefully, particularly the parts about the emotional brain. And so I finally did construct a fairly simple model of the emotional brain and how it works and all that stuff. Basically what it is the rest of the brain is constantly observing the outside world and observing the fantasies that we have in our head, and it's sending all that information to the emotional brain. And the circuits in the emotional brain recognize different types of emotional situations. Oh, this is a funny emotional situation. And if it's a funny emotional situation, the emotional brain generates an emotional response of laughter. Or the emotional brain may say, oh, this is a sad situation. I'm watching a sad movie, or I've just lost my pet has died, or something else. I've lost something that really hurts me. The emotional brain will give us a response of sadness. It will recognize this as a sad situation and give us an emotional response of sadness. Or somebody does something that pisses us off. Our emotional brain recognizes this as a situation of anger, and it generates an anger response. Now, all of these responses have about 5 parts. One part is in consciousness. The emotional brain sends information to consciousness so that we feel angry, we feel sad, we feel like laughing. Another part of it is the muscular response that we have, the laughter, the tears, the angry yelling at somebody. So that's another part of it, is the actual behavior, the emotional behavior. That gets sent out by the emotional brain. But then the emotional brain makes changes in our body. It can send information down the spinal cord here to our entire body, and it sends information to our heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, our digestive system, our hormone systems, our immune systems. Every cell in the body is affected by this emotional output. And so, the particular emotional moods that we get in will change everything in our body and will change our consciousness and how we feel, the emotional feelings and consciousness. So the emotional brain is an input, processing, output system. Everything that happens to us is input to the emotional brain. It processes it by recognizing what type of situation this is. And there's one type we haven't mentioned, a sexy situation. Okay? And then the emotional brain sends output. Well, for a sexy situation, some of that output goes to consciousness, and we feel the sense of being turned on. We feel the sense of being erotically interested in a particular individual or a particular stimulus of some sort. And we feel an urge to engage in sexual activity, but our body has to be prepared to engage in sexual activity. Our body has to become aroused. Our sexual organs have to become aroused. And so the emotional brain sends impulses down the nervous system to the blood vessels that flow into the sex organs, opens up those blood vessels, and the heart pumps blood into the sex organs. It pumps the penis up into an erection. An erection is not a muscular response. An erection is more like a water balloon getting filled with water, only it's billions or millions of water balloons throughout the penis being held in long sheaths that all are being filled up at the same time. So you've got a zillion water balloons filling up these tough sheaths, 3 sheaths that are like forming a column, a 3-part column, and that's an erection. It's a blood vessel response. It's got nothing to do with muscles at all. So there's no point going to the gym and trying to do pull-ups and push-ups and bar presses and all the rest of that crap in order to have a better erection. Your erection has 0 to do with your muscles. Your erection has to do with your emotional brain. It's the emotional brain that simply sends nerve impulses down to those blood vessels. The blood vessels open up, the heart pumps, because the emotional brain is also sending nerve impulses to the heart to make it pump harder and faster. And so the heart pumps the blood into the blood vessels. They flow down to the sex organs, flow into the sex organs, and this is true for women too. Vaginal lubrication is a result of the emotional brain sending nerve impulses down the spine to the sex organs, the female sex organs, and the blood flows into the walls of the vagina, causing the walls of the vagina to open out like this, to balloon up, so there's a bigger space inside the vagina, and at the same time, that fluid, that blood fluid, gets filtered through the walls of the vagina, and the vaginal lubrication is the clear plasma fluid of blood, without any red blood cells or anything like that in it, but just more or less water and salts. And that is the vaginal lubrication that comes down, lubricates the vaginal lips, making penetration easier. And at the same time, the blood vessels going into the clitoris also open up. The heart pumps blood into the clitoris, and the clitoris becomes erect, and it rises up against the little hood that covers it. And sometimes the tip of the clitoris will extend forward out from the hood. And you have a clitoral erection, which is part of female arousal. And all of that comes from the emotional brain. So this is why we need to have a healthy emotional brain in order to have healthy sexual responses. Because the overall sexual response consists of 2 parts. First, sexual arousal, and then sexual stimulation, sexual physical stimulation, and emotional stimulation of becoming more and more intimate with the partner, or in our fantasy, more and more intimate with the partner. Somehow the situation becomes more and more sexy, and we become more and more aroused, and we have physical sensations of pleasure on the surface of our sex organs. And that physical pleasure comes back up the spine into the emotional brain again and fills consciousness with feelings of sexual pleasure. But that's not enough to cause the orgasm reflex, usually. There has to be at the same time a certain amount of emotional excitement and arousal, which of course there usually is. I mean, if you are sexually aroused, that's because you are emotionally aroused. So there's already a certain amount of emotional arousal in consciousness, and then you add the physical pleasure sensations to that, and the cocktail, the mixture of the two, the emotional and physical sensations, creates a burst of euphoria in consciousness that is too much for consciousness to contain. And so some of that energy bounces back down. It's like a basketball that you throw, and it rebounds off the backboard. Well, some of that energy rebounds off the surface of consciousness, the outside perimeter of consciousness, and bounces right back down into the emotional brain. And it comes down to about this area right here. And right there is the orgasm reflex trigger center. And when that trigger center gets activated, the orgasm reflex gets activated. What is a reflex? A reflex is something involuntary, like a sneeze. A sneeze is a reflex. We don't voluntarily sneeze, and we don't voluntarily laugh. Laughter is an emotional reflex. Sobbing is an emotional reflex, not something we do voluntarily. Losing our temper is an emotional reflex. When it happens and without our even intending it to, but we lose our temper, that's an emotional reflex. An orgasm is an emotional reflex. So once the orgasm reflex gets started, it contracts these muscles in the sex organs. In the male, those contractions create ejaculation of the semen. Each contraction causes the semen to spurt out of the penis. In a female, the contractions are around the vagina and around the base of the clitoris, and they create sensations of pleasure. So, as a humanistic psychologist interested in helping us all develop our innate potential for sexual pleasure to its maximum extent, it's important for us. See, that's what I'm interested in doing. And what I'm saying is that in order to have that happen, we need to be conflict-free about sex. In order to really have relaxed, expansive sexual pleasure, super euphoric sexual pleasure, we need to not have conflicts of guilt or shame about our own sexual activity. We need to feel that our sexual activity is perfectly good, perfectly fine, and is a good thing because we are generating euphoric states of consciousness for ourselves, and if we have a partner, for our partner. And euphoric states of consciousness are the only things that have intrinsic value. Euphoric states of consciousness are intrinsically good. Everything else that we do is just a means to the end of ultimately producing euphoric consciousness. And so sexuality is one of the most direct ways of producing euphoric consciousness for ourselves. So we should be happy and feel good about ourselves when we have the capacity to create these euphoric states of consciousness and to have powerful orgasms, because orgasms are the way of satisfying our sex drive. Just as if we're hungry, food is the only thing that will satisfy our hunger drive. To satisfy our sex drive, we need orgasms. And just as if you're really hungry and you only get a little bit of food, it doesn't really satisfy your hunger drive. If you are horny, if you have a lot of sexual drive energy, and you only have a little orgasm, it won't really satisfy your sex drive. What we want to have is the biggest orgasms possible, the most powerful orgasms possible, the most pleasurable orgasms possible, because they will satisfy our sex drive completely. When you have a cosmic orgasm, a full consciousness orgasm, afterwards you have no vestige of sex drive left. And you have no guilt about it. Because that's very important, not to go from the pleasure of an orgasm to a feeling of guilt and self-loathing, which is something that many of us are prone to because the society we live in has traditionally been a sex-shaming society. And every form of sex, except strictly procreative sex, was made a matter of shaming and was labeled as something immoral, something bad, a sin, in fact. And that's because our culture, sadly enough, has been a delusional culture for thousands and thousands of years, living under the delusion that there is an imaginary spirit being who is observing all of us, that created the entire universe with 400 billion galaxies out there, but the universe has its eye on all of us. This is a delusional worldview because spirit beings, non-physical entities, can never be observed by us or detected by us in any way, shape, or form. Therefore, we can know nothing about them. We can only imagine them and guess about them, but we have no possible way of knowing whether any non-physical being exists or not. And if it did happen to exist, knowing anything about it and what it liked and didn't like, what it would approve of or disapprove of in human behavior. But people, for thousands of years, have made the original intellectual sin of believing that it is possible to imagine the unknowable and have those imaginings be true. And then believing that those imaginings are true, it is legitimate to force everyone else to imagine the unknowable in exactly the same way, or else you call them an immoral, sinful person. This is delusional. No one knows the mind of God. No one knows the mind of the universe. No one should ever be arrogant enough to claim that they do know not the slightest single thing for certain about anything non-physical that cannot be demonstrated to us with physical evidence of some sort that we can all agree upon is there and is real. But people have institutionalized the process of making false truth claims about the unknowable, and they've called it religion. And our culture has been dominated by religion for thousands of years. And that has given us an irrational, sex-negative culture where adults, on the basis of this delusional worldview, take it upon themselves to make young people feel guilty about their sexual drives, their natural biological sexual drives. We cannot help having sexual drives because we are a species that has been formed by natural selection. And natural selection has only allowed individuals to survive who have strong sex drives and mate with other individuals. So we are the product of selective breeding for sexiness that has occurred over millions of years. And so we have a natural sex drive, and it is absolutely bullshit to pretend that we don't and to say that we shouldn't have good sexual education to help us satisfy our innate natural biological sex drive in a way that is both satisfying and completely safe and emotionally healthy for us. And it is not emotionally healthy for adults to tell young people that they just shouldn't have sexual feelings, and that if they do have sexual feelings, that they are immoral for having those sexual feelings. No, they are natural human beings with natural sexual drives. And the human species happens to be one of the most highly sexed species on the planet. It's just a fact that we are sexy year-round. It doesn't matter what season of the year it is, we're sexy. You know, it doesn't matter if there's any females around us who happen to be in estrus, and that means fertile. Human females become fertile once a month. That doesn't happen in the other primates. Chimpanzee females become fertile once in 4 years. Same thing with gorillas. So human sexuality is completely different. Somehow, probably about 70,000 years ago, humanity evolved a supercharged sex drive. Now, it may have happened longer than 70,000 years ago, but 70,000 years ago, the human ancestral population had shrunk to 3,000 breeding couples, about a total population of maybe 10,000. And all of us are descended from those 10,000 people living in East Africa 70,000 years ago. So I think that was about the time of the Toba supervolcano down in Indonesia that blew up and created a 10,000 year cooling period, a sudden ice age. And there was lots of extinctions. So at that point, life must have all of a sudden changed so drastically around the world, and including in Africa, that many species went extinct. And our own ancestral species was reduced to 10,000 individuals, 3,000 breeding pairs. So at that point, it would make sense for those breeding pairs who were most prolific at producing offspring to have their genes become the most common genes in the population that descended from them. And so the human species has had, I think, a very, very high sex drive ever since then, when we were recovering from that ecological catastrophe, basically. At least, I mean, that's just a theory, but something like that had to happen in order for human beings at some point in our ancestral history to become much more sexual than any of the other primates or any of the other, except possibly the bonobos. But what we've got now is a sex drive that is way surplus to requirements, way surplus to requirements, and we are overpopulating the planet. And so at this point, what we need to do is find safe and easy and sensible ways for satisfying our sex drive, doing it intelligently, and making it as sexy as possible without being procreative. limiting our procreative sex very drastically so that each couple has no more than 2 children in order to just stabilize the population. But all of us have an excess of sex drive, and the Christians have tried to just make us ignore that, for centuries. It's like an ostrich sticking its head in the sand and pretending, oh yeah, you can just ignore sex until you get married, whenever that happens to be, And what that means is either you marry way too young, at the age of 20, or you have to wait, until you're 30 and never have sex until then. And in the meantime, be in a constant battle with your own sex drive. And that's what Christianity sets up for us with its sexual morality, is a constant battle against our own sex drive, which is nuts. As Wilhelm Reich, the first of the sex-positive psychologists, said, the human species is the only one insane enough to ever go to war with its own emotions and its own instincts and its own natural biological sex drive. So that's what my goal is, to help you to enjoy sexuality without guilt and enjoy the best possible orgasms that you can have. And to do that, we have to look at our own sexual development. Each of us has had a unique sexual development, and none of us has grown up in a natural sexual environment where our sexual development has been encouraged and supported by the adults around us. So all of us have had, in one way or another, an unnatural and strange sexual environment, sexual learning environment to grow up in. And our most important critical periods of sexual development are from the ages of 3 to 7, the childhood period, and then from puberty on up into our early 20s. And during those periods of time, we are not getting the kind of helpful, supportive sexual instruction and experience that we deserve to have in order to develop strong and healthy sex drives and sexual responses and sexual happiness in our relationships throughout our entire life. So I'll talk more about this next time. Thanks very much for listening.